Hello, and welcome to episode 16 of the Sci-Fi Podcast. From Bloomington, Indiana, I'm Nick Zoutro. I am pleased to introduce our guest for today, Dr. Lindley Darden, professor of philosophy and historian of biology at the University of Maryland, College Park. Lindley's research focuses on reasoning in scientific change. In her first book, Theory, Change, and Science, Lindley argues, contra Kuhn, that science is a self-correcting enterprise which progresses through a thoroughly piecemeal process of reiterative refinement consisting of three stages: theory construction, theory assessment, and theory modification. Furthermore, Lindley illuminates the process of constructing scientific theories by positing various strategies that she claims are sufficient for solving actual historical cases of theory change. For example, she examines the Mendelian theory of the gene, which underwent significant theoretical modifications from around 1900, when Mendel was rediscovered, to 1926, when Thomas Hunt Morgan published his famous textbook defining Mendelian theory in its roughly modern form. Looking at these cases, Lindley describes procedures for devising the hypotheses that early 20th century Mendelian theorists actually proposed. Ultimately, by constructing a list of such strategies for discovery, Lindley hopes that scientists can use them to solve present theoretical problems that contemporary science encounters. Lindley has also worked extensively on mechanisms, notably in her collaborative paper entitled Thinking About Mechanisms, co-authored with Peter Mockemer and Carl Craver, something we talk about in the interview. And in 2006, she completed her second book entitled Reasoning in Biological Discoveries, Essays on Mechanisms, Interfield Relations, and Anomaly Resolution. In it, she offers a number of strategies for discovering mechanisms in biology, including schema instantiation, modular subassembly, and forward-backward chaining. And finally, Lindley's current area of research focuses on computational methods for aiding the discovery of molecular biological and disease mechanisms. Needless to say, Lindley is an outstanding philosopher of science who I was thrilled to have on the show. From chatting with her, I've learned that we both share a similar approach to doing philosophy of science, which is to make contact with actual historical developments and or current scientific work in order to ground one's work in the sciences. This integrated HPS approach is something Lindley goes into a bit more in detail on the podcast, and I think you'll enjoy learning more about it. And so, without further ado, let's bring in Lindley. Dr. Lindley Darden, welcome to the Sci-Fi Podcast. How are you this morning?
I'm doing fine, thank you.
That's great. So where are you currently located?
I am at the University of Maryland in College Park. It's where I'm teaching. At this very moment, I'm at my home, which is in Greenbelt, Maryland.
Great. Okay. How far is that from the university?
Oh, it's about a 10-minute drive. It's quite close.
Nice. Any benefits to living, is it Greenboro, you said?
Greenbelt.
Greenbelt.
Well, Greenbelt was a historic town built during the New Deal, during the Roosevelt administration, and so it's a very nice community. When you walk into it, it looks more like an English village, which actually was modeled after, than sprawling suburban Maryland. So it's a rather charming place to live, and a lot of things are in walking distance. There's a lake, there's a swimming pool, a grocery store. There are sidewalks to walk and inner pathways to get to things. So it's a nice planned community that's been here over 75 years, and I've enjoyed living here, and it's quite convenient to the university.
Yeah, just 10 minutes away. That's very convenient. And how long have you been teaching at Maryland?
Oh, well, goodness, over 40 years now. It was my first job after I got my PhD from the University of Chicago.
Oh, that's great. So you've really got to see it come up and develop, I imagine.
Yes. For a while, we had a committee on history and philosophy of science, which was ideal for me. But after some people left and retired, that group disbanded. And so now I'm just part of the philosophy of science group within the philosophy department.
Okay. Well, I'm excited to hear about that. But before we do that, I'd love to take a step back and, just start back at the beginning and ask, where did you grow up?
I grew up in northern Mississippi. in a town called New Albany, which is about 30 miles from Oxford, where the University of Mississippi is.
New Albany. Okay. And what was it like in New Albany?
Small town, about 8,000 people. Hilly country. It's not the big flat delta of along the Mississippi River with the big cotton plantations. It was not like that. There were small farms and houses. My father was a lawyer, and my grandmother had some acres which were originally cotton farmed, but were later planted into pine trees. So I grew up being able to walk around in natural settings, as did my brother, and he became a wildlife biologist. So we both think that we had kind of roots within the land and the trees and the birds and so on that influenced us. He became a wildlife biologist, and I became a philosopher of biology. So it was a small town south. I did the best I could with that school system, but it was not a terrific school system, I can certainly see in retrospect. I enjoyed science classes. That's where I thought the most fun things went on, and so I was interested in science as I came out of that school system.
Okay. And so I was really curious about what was it about the school that you didn't find particularly enriching?
Well, the history teachers were all football and basketball coaches. So I didn't realize history was an interesting discipline until I got to graduate school, really, or maybe, I guess college. I had some quite good history teachers in college. So I think I had pretty good English teachers and pretty good math teachers. Not such good science teachers, but I liked science anyway. But small town southern schools have trouble getting really good teachers, and so I think it wasn't the best possible school system.
Were there? I was going to ask if there's charter schools, private schools in the surrounding area, or was it?
Not when I was growing up. I was there in the 50s and 60s, and that was pre-integration. So there were black schools and white schools, and the private academies that the segregationists set up are much more common down in the Mississippi Delta. In the Delta, there are counties that are 80% black. And there, the white people wanted to have private schools to maintain segregation. In the northeastern part of the state, there were only 13% black in my county, and so they were successfully integrated after I left high school. I've been back for high school reunions and talked to parents and so on. So they've had successful integration since I was there, and the public schools are still where people send their children. Okay,
but during your time from early school, elementary, middle school, high school, there was segregation throughout.
There was segregation, and there weren't any private schools nearby.
Okay. Wow. That's a very different time.
It was indeed.
Yeah. So, but you mentioned you were interested in the sciences. Any science in particular?
Well, I enjoyed chemistry, and so I went to college with the plan of majoring in chemistry.
Oh, okay. And what was it about chemistry that attracted you?
Figuring out how atoms work. And as a child, my grandmother was one of my grandmothers was a third grade teacher, and we had lots of books in my house, and she gave me this book that I still have. It was called How Big is Big, How Small is Small. So I was introduced to the topic of reduction as a child. So, to figure out the small things that you can't see is something I'm still, of course, doing with my work on mechanisms. It's something that this book my grandmother gave me as a child, this children's science book, really fascinated me.
That's a perfect title for a children's book. It has both rich scientific and philosophical questions just embedded within the content.
It does, yes.
I recall as a young child having interesting conceptions of such as infinity or perhaps an atom. Do you recall any, like, what your conception of an atom was growing up?
Oh, well, the Bohr model of the atom as a little planetary system seemed like quite a good model from my point of view. And my father would bring home books like with math puzzles. I remember we spent an afternoon one time talking about Dedekind cuts, which is the idea that with a number line, you can keep cutting it and getting any number in between any other number. Somehow, that's not quite the infinity you were talking about, but it does have that implication. And I just found this fascinating. So I grew up in a kind of intellectual atmosphere, and I'm sure that was a good thing for me.
So Dad was a lawyer with scientific interests. Is that
he read very widely. Like he would read us classic books like Treasure Island and Robinson Crusoe. He would go to Memphis or St. Louis and go to bookstores and bring home books. And I remember the first time I went to the University of Mississippi and saw the bookstore, and I thought, oh, I can buy all these paperback books. How wonderful. Our library was useful but somewhat limited. So we had lots of books around, and books were an important part of my life. And my father had very general reading interests.
Very nice. What about Mom? Was she similarly, or?
She had been my father's legal secretary, and she was a very good mother. Not so intellectually interested, but very good with people. She was often very good friends with my friends. We had a large house with a basement, and the basement was where a lot of my friends kind of hung out. That was a weekend spot, and she would cook breakfast for us all, and so it was a very nice social atmosphere that my mother was able to create for us.
Well, that's great. That's great. Good to hear. Okay, so growing up, interested in science, were there other interests going on in the high school formative years? Any clubs, organizations you were a part of?
I was part of various clubs, but I was much more interested in studying and my intellectual work than I was with any of the particular extracurricular activities. A good friend of mine was editor of the Annual. That's where the pictures of everybody was put and the pictures of the clubs, and I worked on that. And after I got accepted to college, I went out for cheerleading and became a basketball cheerleader.
Oh, wow.
Cheerleading was a big social thing, and I'd never had much interest in it. I remember the summer the football cheerleaders went to Ole Miss to a cheerleading camp. I was in a National Science Foundation summer science camp. So I was always much more intellectually oriented than all the sports, football, cheerleading, homecoming kind of stuff. That was a big part of the social life of my high school and still is in the South. But it was not something that I took as a primary interest of mine. And I went to lots of basketball games, and frankly, I've never wanted to go to a stinky gym since I was basketball cheerleader.
Just enough time in there was...
Yeah, enough of basketball.
Well, I've heard Maryland has a pretty good basketball team, but I imagine you kind of like...
Yes, the women waded up into the final something or other of this last tournament, and sometimes the men or the women win championships.
Yeah.
So
that's interesting. I recall. Well, I've seen television shows about the South and the high school environment in terms of football being very big and people. I'm not sure if that's, maybe I'm confusing that with some of the other southern states.
No, it really is, and well, it still is. I mean, I was just at this Deep South philosophy biology workshop, and the people from the state universities were all talking about their football teams and who won, and that apparently at Ole Miss they would now wear the people dress up. The girls wear formal gowns, and the men wear coats and ties to the football games. That was not true when my father took me to those when I was a child.
Yeah.
But it's football and tailgating. Like John Bickel is at Mississippi State, and he was talking about learning to cook an entire pig so he could have a really big tailgate party.
Well, people find meaning in whatever there is to do around the town, and football just happens to be what it is in the South.
Football is definitely a big thing in the South.
Okay. So, all right. So, carrying on to undergrad. Well, where did you go to undergrad?
I went to Rhodes College in Memphis, Tennessee, which is one of the better small liberal arts colleges in the South. We considered Vanderbilt as our rival, but that was sort of a bit much because we were just a college and they're, of course, a university. But I would say Rhodes and Vanderbilt are the two best undergraduate places in Tennessee.
It's a beautiful campus. I'm just looking at it here.
It's beautiful. Yes, there's a sandstone quarry in Arkansas that all of that stone comes from, and they build all the buildings out of it. So I went to Rhodes and to the University of Chicago, so I expect campuses to be fake Gothic.
Of course.
Both of them are very nice fake Gothic. We didn't have gargoyles at Rhodes the way University of Chicago does, but the spires and the arches and the towers, they both have that.
Well, I've heard Chicago has recently installed a bunch of, is it limestone or just, I think it might be limestone, but just like 15 years ago or something like very recently, not like, but made to look as if it has been there for centuries.
Well, now at the University of Maryland, all of our buildings are red brick with white. Some of the old ones have white columns. So when they build the new buildings, they bring in these bricks already all stuck together, and they stick up, planks, as it were, of brick onto the outside of the buildings made out of something else. But at least they keep architectural integrity. Maryland is now part of the Big Ten, and I remember going to a lot of the Big Ten campuses, maybe even Indiana, and there's all just mishmash architecture. There's no effort to keep them all in the same architectural style. And I'm happy to say all of the colleges and universities I've been associated with, there was a single style that was maintained to some degree.
Great. So how did you like your time at Rhodes College?
It was a very good place for me. I started out majoring in chemistry, and there was a curious requirement, and I've reflected on why they might have had this requirement. But as a sophomore, you had to take either philosophy or psychology, which I've never heard of anywhere else. But it is, in fact, quite good, because if you're going to major in either of those, it's very good to know that as a sophomore. Because typically one hasn't had it in high school. Certainly in small southern high schools, there was no psychology or philosophy when I was coming through. And I'd always wanted to know what Plato said, so I took philosophy, and I really liked it. I had a survey history class, and we did, in fact, read Plato dialogues, and I had a very good teacher. And I was taking chemistry classes and doing okay, except not in the labs. It turns out I don't have really good fine motor control. If I try to sew in a button, I can stick myself with the pen. I mean, I was never going to be a bench scientist, but I didn't realize how important that physical technique
Some dexterity was, yeah.
I think a major goal of undergraduate education should be breadth, so students can find out what they're good at and what they like and what they're not good at, and get to know who they are. And Rhodes was very good for that. There were these courses. It was associated originally with the Presbyterian Church, and there were these courses that were called Bible courses, but they were very much kind of existential self-exploration courses. Some of them were, who are you and what are your values and what do you want to do with your life? And those were, I think, good things to expose undergraduates to.
Do you have a course like that you recall, a more existentially invigorating course?
I did take such a course at Rhodes. I don't know that we have any at Maryland at the moment, but we really did have to reflect on our values and what we wanted to do with ourselves. And I think that was a good thing. And that's exactly what happened to me. I took a philosophy of science class, and I loved it. And I realized that's where I belonged, thinking about science, but not literally going in the lab and doing chemical experiments.
Yeah. And so what is it about thinking about science that really motivated you, and how, like, what was it about that told you that this is what I wanted, this is where I belong, as opposed to maybe, say, doing the lab experiments exclusively?
Well, this comes from thinking about one's general value system. And NPR has this very nice series called This I Believe. And I've thought about, if I were going to write such a thing about myself, I really believe in knowledge. And I believe that science is our best methodology for getting knowledge about the world. And so and as an undergraduate in my philosophy of science class, we studied Hansen's patterns of discovery. And so the idea of how is it that human beings have discovered new knowledge, how is it new ideas enter the development of science, was a question that I really found fascinating, and I've really been there ever since. I've been interested in scientific discovery and the kind of reasoning that goes on in scientific discovery, and what goes into making new knowledge, and if you're talking about scientific knowledge, that's philosophy of science.
Very nice, very nice. So there was a pretty quick shift from chemistry into philosophy of science, or
what happened over the 3 years? I guess from sophomore to junior year, and by senior year, I was majoring in philosophy.
Okay. Any other?
I knew a lot of chemistry, and I'd had some biology, which is going to make a difference when I get to Chicago, once we get to that discussion.
Yeah, so you mentioned Chicago. So was this a transfer, or was this...
No, I graduated with a bachelor's degree in philosophy from Rhodes, and we just had to take comprehensive exams in our major at the end of our senior year at Rhodes, which served me very well, taking preliminary exams at the University of Chicago. At the time, I was getting married. I'm now divorced, so this was a short period in my life, but it did determine that I went to Chicago. I had gotten a full 5-year fellowship to History and Philosophy of Science at Indiana.
Oh, wow.
And I had been planning to go there.
Oh,
and that's
how
when
about that?
it was after Hansen had died. I never got to meet Hansen, to my regret. But Stammen was there, and maybe Ron Gary was there at the time. I forget exactly who the faculty were. I was naive, as many undergraduates were, that I didn't realize what you do for graduate school is pick a faculty person to work with. But I went to interview at Indiana and Chicago and other places, and my fiance, then to be husband as we went off to college, to graduate school together, was going to med school.
Okay.
And so he got in several places, but I don't think there is a med school in Bloomington. Is that correct?
I think they now have a campus, but I think the main school was originally in Indianapolis, and then
So I think
I'm not sure how old it could have been. It came out later. To be honest, I'm not sure of the history.
Yeah, that wasn't an option in terms of the two of us going there together, but Chicago was, and that's what determined that I went to the University of Chicago. And so he went to med school, and I went to graduate school. And then we went our separate ways after we both graduated. But it turned out to be just there couldn't have been a better place in the world for me to do philosophy of biology than at the University of Chicago in the 1970s.
Yeah, so I've spoken with a couple of folks who've been at U Chicago. So yeah, what was it about for you? What was so what did you like so much about philosophy of biology there?
I went with the idea that I would just do general philosophy of science, and then I spent the first year in the philosophy department. I did very well in my preliminary exams because, as I said, I just had at least a history of philosophy exam as an undergraduate, so I passed that one with no trouble. And The Logic and Philosophy of Science one was my special interest, and I passed that one just fine. I did not quite as high a pass in ethics, but I'd had enough of that. So I did very well in my first year at the University of Chicago with the courses I was taking and passing preliminary exams. But I wasn't sure if I wanted to teach. I knew I wanted to have a job, and I'd been thinking I would be a chemist and have some kind of lab job, but now the idea was if I'm going to get a degree in philosophy, an advanced degree, what am I going to do with myself? So I dropped out of graduate school and I taught in a junior college for a year. And I'd been shy, and I wasn't at all sure I wanted to teach, and what was I going to do. And
was this in Chicago, or where was this junior college?
It was out in the suburbs of Chicago. It was called Moraine Valley Community College, and I had to get a car, and I had to learn to drive on the Dan Ryan Expressway.
That's a scary,
I commuted from Hyde Park out to the suburbs. And it was a really wonderful experience. I discovered, to my surprise, I was actually pretty good at teaching. I could easily get discussions going and have lively times with my students, and my students liked me and I liked them. And so I decided, well, wow, this really is a career prospect for me. It was an empirical discovery. I didn't expect it at all, actually.
That's phenomenal.
And so I taught introductory philosophy 5 times in this junior college, and I thought, I've got to get back to graduate school. I can't do this forever. So in the meantime, a new committee was formed. Chicago has committees that are interdisciplinary that give degrees. They're like interdisciplinary programs that are degree granting. They're called committees. And so the Committee on Conceptual Foundations of Science was being started at Chicago. And Ken Schaffner and Dudley Shapiro and a group of biologists, which included Dick Lewontin and Dick Levins before they left for Harvard. And Stu Kaufman was there. A really great group of biologists, Lee Van Valen did evolutionary theory. I worked with a guy named Throckmorton who did systematics. So they were forming this interdisciplinary committee, and a number of biologists, including Arnold Raven, who was a geneticist and a historian of genetics, was part of it. And so I became the first student in the Committee on Conceptual Foundations of Science. And then others got admitted over the years I was there. And the requirements for it were philosophy and science and logic, which I had already satisfied by passing that preliminary exam, a master's degree in your chosen science, and the history of that science. And, of course, most of the field was dominated by philosophy of physics at the time. I couldn't have gotten a master's in physics. It would have taken me 5 years to get a master's in physics.
Oh, sure.
But with my chemistry and philosophy, my chemistry and biology background I already had, I was able to get a master's in biology in 5 quarters, so a little less than 2 years, while I was also taking philosophy and history classes. So it worked out really well. I chose biology, and there were all these biologists that were associated with the committee, and I could take courses with them and work with them. And we had this wonderful evening group. We stayed at faculty houses, and we would either read papers that somebody in the group was writing. We read Stu Kaufman's Articulation of Parts explanation paper, which has become a classic in the field. And they would read student papers, and or we'd read journal articles. And it was really wonderful. Stu Kaufman claims that we founded philosophy of biology with that group. Now, I think Michael Roos might disagree.
Sure.
but Michael Roos agrees that Lewontin and that group had an enormous influence on philosophy of biology. So Michael was kind of isolated up there at Guelph, but David Hull lived in the area. He came and taught. He ended up being on my dissertation committee. So it was a really wonderful place to get trained as a philosopher of biology in the 1970s.
That sounds phenomenal. It's just this community forming, getting together, outside of the class. It sounds like a great place to be. Do you recall any of the discussions if philosophy of biology was really starting to form as its own discipline around that time, or subdiscipline in the philosophy of science? Like, what kinds of questions in philosophy of biology were you interested in?
Well, Ken Schaffner was very influential with regard to that, and he was interested in relations between discovery and justification. Some of his early papers deal with that. And he was using historical case studies. He went to interview François Jacob and Jacques Monod in Paris and wrote a really excellent paper about their work, and we did that in a seminar, that whole episode of the discovery of gene regulation. Mm-hmm. And so I got to know the history of molecular biology pretty well, working with Ken Schaffner and taking biology classes. I was working in systematics, and of course David Hull had been working on that, and the philosophy of systematics was something that I considered as a dissertation topic, but I finally decided, humans eventually just decide whether they're going to use a cladistic system or a phonetic system and so on. And I decided not to go into law, which my father did, because I regarded it as just something that humans make decisions about, as opposed to making discoveries about the nature of the world, which I was interested in. And so I thought systematics was a little too much, just arbitrarily you pick some way of doing a classification system. And there are all kinds of interesting conceptual issues there, and there's actually quite a room for philosophers of biology to have things to say about that, and people do. But I decided not to do that. So my dissertation ended up being on scientific change. This was the era of Kuhn, and I was trained as a post-positivist, post-Kuhnian philosopher of science. Both Shapiro and Schaffner were critics of Kuhn.
So for our less involved listeners in the philosophy of science, what does it mean to maintain a post-Kuhnian, post-positivist position in this?
Well, the positivists, or the logical empiricists, as they're sometimes called, Ernst Nagel, Karl Hempel, were famous philosophers of science in the mid-20th century, trying to apply logic to understanding the structure of scientific reasoning. And, of course, there'd been quite a success at applying logic to, say, understanding the foundations of mathematics earlier in the 20th century. And so technical symbolic logic and mathematical physics seem to be natural fits together. And a lot of the philosophy of science in logical positivism dealt with applying logic to understanding the structure of science and scientific reasoning. Yep. And I personally found that sort of interesting intellectually, but it didn't apply to the science that I knew. It seemed too technical and too idealized and too far removed from actual science, and it's certainly quite removed from what biologists do. And then Kuhn, Thomas Kuhn's Structure of Scientific Revolutions was one of the major books of the 20th century, and it had a view of scientific change in terms of revolutions, and that had a pretty radical notion that there were different ways of looking at the world, or an Aristotelian world, a Newtonian world, an Einsteinian world, a Copernican. He talked a bit about the Copernican revolution. It was another book of his. And he thought that science occurred by revolutions, and then everything that came before would be dismissed. And that didn't seem to me correct. It seemed to me science was more progressive than Kuhn thought. And I went to ask him. I got to go to a conference.
Oh, really?
Sit by him at dinner. And I said to him, we'd just been reading Kuhn in a philosophy of science class, and I said, do you really think that the Aristotelian worldview is as good as a Newtonian worldview? And he said, yes, it's just different.
Oh, okay.
And I found it shocking, especially since he came from physics and knew so much about the history of physics. But I was trained to think, yes, we can talk about objectivity in science. Yeah. And so Ken Schaffner, Dudley Shapiro, Arnold Raven, eventually Stephen Toulmin came. After Shapiro and Schaffner left and Stephen Toulmin came, I had a changing population of senior philosophers of science to work with in those days. And they all had a much more rational view of science, I thought, than Kuhn. And so I was trained as a post-positivist, post-Kuhnian philosopher of science, seeing science, looking at scientific change in a more progressive way, looking for more objectivity in terms of credentialing of scientific knowledge.
Sure. And that's typically, what I think is in a more general education setting is what you might learn in terms of what science is or how it works, or at least how we would like it to work at times.
Exactly.
All right. Yeah, cool. So how was your experience then? You've been in Maryland for quite some time. What was your experience coming out of graduate school and into your first job?
Well, I was very fortunate. The market was much better then than it is now. And Maryland was building up in interdisciplinary areas. They were hiring a philosopher of economics, that was Dan Hausman, philosophy of music, philosophy of X was sort of what the department saw itself as doing. It was building in that area. So they wanted a philosopher of biology. And there were only 2 of us on the market in the country at the time. It shows you I got in very early. I don't think I was part of the first group, but I was definitely part of the second group in the field.
Okay.
So David Hull has been my teacher. So I think David Hull and Michael Roos would be considered the more senior, Marjorie Green, the more senior people, and then I was in the next wave, as it were. And the only other person on the market was Mary Williams, and I don't know what has happened to her. I've often asked people that. If anyone hears this podcast and knows what happened to the philosopher of biology, Mary Williams, at Delaware, it would be really interesting to let me know. She had a view of axiomatizing natural selection, which influenced Alex Rosenberg, and he still cites that work of hers. It was too positivistic for me. I didn't want to apply logic to understanding evolution, but she did. And so she and I were the 2 people on the market in philosophy of biology, and Maryland wanted a philosopher of biology, and I was very fortunate to get the offer. And then the only other job in the country that I was ideally qualified for was at Minnesota. And eventually John Beatty had that job. And so I was about to go for an interview at Minnesota. And I'd already gotten the offer from Maryland, and Sam Gorovitz was the chair here. And he sent me this little handwritten note. He said, "It's very cold in Minnesota." I didn't even go for the interview. I'd grown up in the South. Chicago was too cold for me. So the Mid-Atlantic has been quite a good place for me in terms of the climate. We don't have much snow here.
Yeah. I can understand that. Yeah, I'm being from Arizona myself. I thought Indiana was cold, and I couldn't imagine what moving to Minnesota would be like. It would be
much colder. Not to be done, in my opinion.
Okay. So those first years at Maryland, what was the department like? What was the atmosphere?
Well, I had a heavy teaching load, and it was a challenge to begin with to get all these courses up and running and learn about undergraduate teaching and continue to do my research and writing on the way to tenure. 5 of us were hired the year I was hired, and it was a very nice group of young folks, and I'm the only one who got tenure. So
really?
It was... Getting a job for me was easy. Getting tenure was terrifying.
What was that like?
I just chained myself to my desk every summer and wrote papers. Some of them came out of my dissertation, and some of them were newer topics. One important one for me was with Nancy Mall. She had been in graduate school with me, and we had some cases that seemed to have some similarities. And we wrote a paper called Interfield Theories. And that paper got some attention. It seemed to resonate with people. It was an anti-reductive perspective on how to bridge ideas from different fields. And she had cases and I had cases, and we wrote the paper jointly. She'd gotten a job at Yale when I got a job here at Maryland. And so I went up to visit her, and we worked together, and we got that paper out. So I worked very hard. I mean, the standards were perfectly clear. You had to have a national and international reputation, and you had to have a set of papers that in the prominent journals.
Yep.
And happily, I succeeded in doing that to the satisfaction of my colleagues.
So how many papers, so, what are we talking about? A handful of papers, a dozen papers?
Five or six, and in refereed journals, and invitation to international conferences. Those are the things that I had on my vita that made a difference for tenure for me.
Okay. And not just attendance at these international conferences, but having your work be somewhat prominent. That you are starting to get invited for symposia, etc.
Yes, how somebody in the first 5 years of their career gets an international reputation is a little challenging. But I did, in fact, have one because of something I had published in a British journal. Yeah. I got an invitation to a conference, and that was taken as an important milestone for me.
Okay. And I didn't actually ask at the beginning in Chicago, and I can imagine this could be the case. How did you came in with interest in general philosophy of science and interest in chemistry, and was it the fact that just the presence of a number of philosophers of biology in Chicago, was that more of the shift of how it came to be that you found yourself as a philosopher of biology, or was there something else going on?
Well, when I entered the Committee on Conceptual Foundations of Science, I had to choose a science with a plan of getting a master's degree in it. And the only two areas that were, for philosophy of the special sciences in the 70s, it was either going to have to be physics or biology. There was no philosophy of chemistry at the time. Had there been, I might have done that, and I followed that as it's grown up slowly over the years. They now have a society, and I spoke one time at that society meeting, and I read some of the things they do. Andrew and Woody, and there are other people that are doing that now, but it didn't exist in the 70s, and it didn't occur to me to try to create it.
Yeah, sure.
So, it was because I had to choose a science, and I had to get a master's degree in the science, and this committee was strong in terms of having prominent biologists associated with it, which I was fortunate enough to work with.
Sure. So I see here one of your featured works in the early 90s was your book Theory Change in Science. You mind telling us a little bit about that and how that came about?
Yeah, well, I was interested in the history of genetics and applying questions about how genetics changed from the late 19th into the 20th century. And my dissertation proposal said I was going to trace the history of genetics from the 1880s up to 1930s. Well, that was very ambitious, as dissertation proposals often are. And I only did genetics at its beginnings in my dissertation. So from the De Vries and the rediscovery of Mendel in 1900 and the beginnings of genetics as a field was what my dissertation was on. So I continued that project, and that's what my first book became. It was the development of genetics as a field and looking at, from a philosophical point of view, what was driving those conceptual changes. And I ended up trying to destroy the distinction between discovery and justification. Philosophers of science had traditionally, and this came out of the old logical positivist tradition, had said there is no logic of discovery, there's only a logic of justification, or Popper would say a logic of falsification.
Yep.
So Karl Popper is, of course, one of the most famous philosophers of science, who had the view that you can't confirm theories, you can only falsify them.
Yeah, a famous philosophy of science in, for example, the social sciences like psychology.
And, well, I've heard scientists in various disciplines quote that.
Yep.
Quote. They don't always know it's Popper,
sure.
But they say, well, we can't confirm, we can just disconfirm.
Yep.
And of course, philosophers have criticized that perspective, but that was a perspective that the idea that there's no logic of discovery, that it's just a matter of a genius psychology coming up with an aha discovery moment, I thought is not, maybe Einstein did that, but mostly that's not how science works. And so I've sort of been arguing against that view my whole career, and I see science, and this is what I argued in my Theory Change book, I see science as a matter of constructing hypotheses, evaluating them, and revising them, and doing that iteratively. And you can certainly see that with the development of genetics from 1900 to the 1930s. Mm-hmm. And Thomas Morgan was a famous geneticist, American geneticist, whose work I talked about extensively in that book. And he said he didn't like to write a book that wasn't going to be out of date in 5 years.
Sure.
And so you can literally trace how things are developing by looking at the books that Morgan and his colleagues published successively over that period of time. So I was able to devise strategies for theory change, as I call them, which is not a logic of discovery. It's not a logic of how to confirm, but there are strategies that I think either were used or could be used by scientists in doing science and changing the ideas in science over time.
Were used or could you use, but not necessarily. Okay, yeah. And do you feel? I'm sorry, I haven't read the book. Is there a continuation? Do you put the arguments and apply them to other areas of science other than genetics, or do you make the special case that, well, at least we see it here? Is this what's going on?
Well, in my ideal world, if I were immortal, I would like to look at a lot of scientific cases.
Just forever. Yeah, it's a lot of work.
One of the methodologies that's so important for those of us in history and philosophy of science is that you really get the history right. And so you have to go to archives, and you have to read the papers, and you have to know your case study really well before you can say things about it in general from a philosophy of science point of view. And that's a methodology that I learned and that I practiced. So I got to know the history of genetics really well.
Yeah.
And I would, of course, was always interested when other people had other cases to see to what extent the strategies I was talking about applied there also. What I personally did in my later work was go on to molecular biology. So that was kind of the later phase of understanding genetics and the gene with the DNA discovery of Watson and Crick and so on. So I carried that case forward and became one of the few in the world philosophers of molecular biology.
Yeah. Okay. And that's interesting. Yeah, I haven't I'm sure folks in philosophy of biology have worked on molecular biology, but not as much, I would say. Not nearly as much.
Not as much as evolutionary theory.
Absolutely. That is true. So it's also the case that you happen to be a co-author on perhaps the most cited paper in philosophy of science, thinking about mechanisms. Cited, looked to me almost 1,817 times, which it sounds like some, a genetics article that came out 5 years ago or something, maybe in the field, which it's just unheard of. Nobody cites philosophers this much. So
it's true. It's really true. I had a student that was doing a citation analysis of a whole group of articles in bioethics, and he found that the most cited ones got about 6 to 8 citations.
Yeah,
considered good.
Phenomenal. Well, those are like really good citations. Those are really important citations. But so
it's been quite amazing to us that the Thinking About Mechanisms paper has gotten as much attention as it has. It's quite amazing.
So how maybe just briefly, how did you come to work with those folks, Peter Mockemer, Carl Craver, in thinking about, other philosophers of biology, philosophers of neuroscience, on this paper, and how did you see it as being so successful as it has been?
Right. Well, I was still working on theory change in molecular biology, and one of the things that I was most interested in about theory change was how one responds to anomalies. So I was working on a book which never got written because mechanisms kind of took over my mind. I was working on a book on anomalies for the central dogma of molecular biology. That's the idea that DNA is directly responsible for making proteins. DNA makes RNA, makes proteins, is what James Watson's way of stating the central dogma. And there are various things that are considered exceptions to that, although it's one of the most universal ways things happen in biology on Earth. So it's a very interesting thing to think of as a possible theory, if we only use the word theory for that. But it isn't exactly a theory. It's actually a schema for the mechanism of protein synthesis I eventually figured out. So I had graduate students. With a graduate student, I'm willing to give them a topic for a master's thesis. For PhD students, they have to find their own topic.
Yep.
But for master's students who are just here for 2 years and they often don't know exactly what they want to do, I will give them a topic.
Yep.
So I had two master's students that worked on 2 of the anomalies for the central dogma, and I was working on another one at the time. I had about 10. And I went to the University of Pittsburgh to their Center for Philosophy of Science as a fellow, and I was working on what was called at the time adaptive mutation controversy. So mostly we think mutants just turn up randomly, but in the 1980s and 90s there was this idea that E. coli bacteria might be able to make a mutant that they needed given a particular environmental challenge. Now, this is sometimes called neo-Lamarckism, so it was a controversial, interesting topic at the time. All right, so all of that is background to where I was getting to. But I was reading papers, and one of them said, 10 possible mechanisms for adaptive mutation. And I thought, there aren't 10 here. I need to analyze this conceptually as a philosopher. This is what we do. What are the different ideas here, and how are they related to each other? And what exactly is it to be a mechanism? Because some of these things were very sketchy, and you wouldn't have called it an adequate description of a mechanism. But philosophers didn't have any analysis of what a mechanism is. In fact, my teacher, Ken Schaffner, had written a very influential book in which he'd said, I don't choose to use the word mechanism, which Bill Wimsatt uses, because we have no analysis of what a mechanism is. So this was a challenge. This was a challenge. So I had lunch with Peter Mockemer one day. Peter is on the faculty at Pittsburgh, and he and I were in graduate school together at Chicago. And he had worked on Galileo and the 17th century mechanical worldview and has a pretty broad perspective on science. And I said to Peter, what's a mechanism? And Peter said something incomprehensible. Peter often dogmatically says things that people can't quite figure out what he's saying, but there's some insight behind there you realize if you just work enough at it. And that's exactly what happened. Peter and I started working on a paper together on the concept of mechanism because there was a challenge in philosophy of science. It hadn't been worked out. Well, it turns out other people had worked on it, and we didn't even know about them until we'd done our own work and started searching the literature, which is kind of a backwards way of doing it, but
sure.
That's what happened with us. So some people had actually been working on it. People from Chicago, people who'd been working with Bill Wimsatt at Chicago. Peter left before Bill Wimsatt came, and Bill came as a postdoc as I was leaving. So he didn't explicitly influence us on this, though we now see him as a fellow traveler. So Carl Craver was a graduate student at the History and Philosophy of Science at Pittsburgh with Peter Mockemer. And he was getting a master's degree in neuroscience. And so I had the examples from molecular biology, and Carl had examples from neuroscience. and Peter had a more general perspective on it all.
Mm-hmm.
And so the three of us ended up collaborating, and it took about 2 years.
Sure.
Carl became a postdoc with me after he finished his PhD at Chicago, and we drove back and forth on the Penn Turnpike often. And we finally were able to finish that paper, and then it came out in Philosophy of Science in the year 2000.
Wow. And have you seen this particular paper? I imagine. I imagine it's not just cited in the philosophy corpus. There must be scientists who are appealing to this paper. Probably a number of them.
And in all sorts of different fields, in the social sciences, in policy, and in government, think tanks, and of course we know that in biology one often explains something by describing the mechanism.
Yep.
And protein synthesis is a very typical one of how is it that proteins form. Well, the DNA gets copied to RNA, which gets the genetic code gets read to determine the order of amino acids in proteins. And so DNA makes RNA makes protein is a schema for the mechanism of protein synthesis. And physiology is just full of the study of mechanisms. I mean, that's what physiologists have done quite successfully over the centuries, if we look back and look at it. I had a student who was in the MD PhD program at Georgetown. He came out and took one of my graduate mechanism seminars. He said, I've just been through the first 2 years of med school, and they taught us about 200 mechanisms in the human body. And he drew pictures of them all, and he had this beautiful sketchbook. So this is very pervasive in biology, and people in the social sciences were already talking about mechanistic explanation independently of us, and they are now part of this whole perspective on giving explanations by describing the mechanism. And it doesn't seem to apply in fundamental physics, where they have mathematical laws, and they often claim things aren't even causal in quantum mechanics or in geometric space-time theories. But many other explanations that are given in the sciences and in social sciences appeal to mechanisms. So it's been very widely taken up as an important new research program.
Fantastic. And so it's been several years since this paper. Do you have any, thoughts now about, where the paper stands and your thoughts on mechanisms in general?
Well, Carl Craver and I worked together for several years and have recently published a new book called In Search of Mechanisms, Discoveries Across the Life Sciences. That was University of Chicago Press in 2013.
Oh, yeah.
And happily, has gotten a good reception. It was voted by the Choice Group, which are librarians, as one of the 25 best academic books for 2014.
Wow, okay.
And we wrote it, the Mockamer-Darden-Craver paper was written for philosophers, and it's a little difficult for some scientists to read. I've had graduate students in biology in my courses, and they say it's very hard for my professor to know what you're talking about from that paper.
Yep.
So Carl and I tried to write this book synthesizing the ideas about mechanisms that we and other people in the field have worked on and trying to get the philosophy of science jargon out of the book. So we wrote it for a more general audience.
Okay.
And I think except for one review by one biologist, I think the reviewers all thought we succeeded with that.
So I imagine this one biologist didn't quite follow along, or was, yeah.
Yeah, I'm not sure what jargon he was finding, but we really tried to get rid of the philosophy jargon.
Sure.
And I was very happy just recently. Holly Anderson, who is a former Pitt student who works on mechanisms, among other things, at Sam Fraser University, said she was invited to come to a biology methodology graduate seminar and talk about mechanisms. And she did, and she recommended our book to the professor. He read it, thinks it's just what he needs, and he's going to use it as a textbook.
Oh, great.
So that is exactly the kind of influence we wanted to have. We have strategies for discovering mechanisms, how to construct a space of possible mechanisms, how to evaluate a proposed mechanistic hypothesis, and how to revise it in the light of anomalies, and then how to connect it in an interlevel, interfield way with other mechanisms. That's the outline of the chapters in this book. And we're delighted that scientists are finding this useful.
Well, fantastic! I'm so glad to hear that, and it's just so great to see the connection between writing some philosophy of science work, but with the intent of connecting it with the scientists themselves. Is this something you had originally set out to do, or what is what has brought about this change in authorship for you?
Well, I always thought it would be good to do things that would be useful to scientists. I never liked Feynman's quote that philosophers of science are to scientists as bird watchers are to birds.
Yeah.
I didn't want to just be watching the scientists. I wanted to be doing things that could be useful for science.
Yeah.
And I've done that my whole career. And so this work has really blossomed in that direction. And I myself am now involved in my latest research in applying it to disease mechanisms. So I have a computational biology collaborator here at the University of Maryland. I'm working now with John Molt. And he has a laboratory. It's out at a branch campus with a research institute out there. It's called the Institute for Bioscience and Biotechnology Research out in Shady Grove, Maryland. It's about an hour's drive for me. And I go out once a week. And we are devising a digital, online, web-based framework for representing disease mechanisms. And at the moment, we've been trying it out with a human genetics class that he and I have been teaching here, and we hope to get experts involved in doing this. So there's now statistical data that connects certain gene mutations with certain disease risks. And the question is, are those mutants actually causal? And if you can find the mechanism to connect them, then they are. If you don't find it, well, maybe you just haven't succeeded yet. But so that we've been looking at Crohn's disease, which is a intestinal bowel disease, and the cause is unknown. But many mutations seem to be found in Crohn's patients that are not found in non-Crohn's patients. And the question is, what kind of role are those playing? Well, so we are conjecturing, and we hope to get other people to help with our conjecturing of mechanistic hypotheses to see if those mutations have a role. Happily, at the institute where we are, there's a wet lab. There's an actual biochemistry, biophysics, structural lab that if we claim, well, what happens in this particular stage of the mechanism is this, they can test it for us. And I've been involved in various computational projects over my whole career. That's another 10 minutes we won't have time to do here. But I've been in artificial intelligence laboratories, and I was at Stanford with a group that helped build the first expert systems. And so I've been involved with computational projects trying to model scientific reasoning since the 1980s.
Oh, wow.
But I've never been involved with a computational group that had a lab that could test their hypotheses.
Yeah,
we could form the hypotheses, but we couldn't actually carry out empirical tests of them. Yeah. And sometimes you can test things computationally, but other times you just need new experimental work. So it's been very gratifying to find such a useful collaborative group here at this stage of my career.
That's phenomenal. Yeah, I'm sure you've had an expansive career. There's probably a number of projects we won't unfortunately get to talk to you, but I'm very interested to learn about in the future. Are there any though, maybe over the course of your time that we haven't brought up that you'd like to share or you like to comment on?
Well, I think right now the major thing I'm doing is the mechanistic work, and we did talk about that. So I think that's okay.
Okay, good. Excuse me. So I was generally curious. What do you see as the some of the greatest challenges facing philosophy of science today? The history, and we can say also the history and philosophy of science.
Right. Well, I'm sorry to say that HPS, as we call it, the combining of historical case studies or detailed work in the current science and philosophy of science, hasn't flourished in the United States as much as I would have liked. It's actually flourishing more in Europe now, and I often go to conferences or have colleagues that I interact with in England and in France and in Germany, the Netherlands, in Scandinavia. So history and philosophy of science is sort of booming in Europe and hasn't so much boomed in the United States. There are only two departments, the one at Indiana and the one at Pittsburgh. Yeah. And various of the interdisciplinary committees, like ours here at Maryland and one at Princeton and other places, have kind of dissolved. And so I think it's really unfortunate that hasn't thrived more, because that's how I was trained, and that's the kind of work I do and that I especially admire. And I think it's really good for philosophers of science to make contact with the actual historical developments or with the current scientific work in order to ground their work in the science. Of course, many philosophers of biology are working with contemporary, particularly evolutionary theory, now to a greater extent ecology, not as much in molecular biology as in my ideal world. So I think I would like to see more history and philosophy of science than we have now. I think it's important for philosophers of science to do things that are relevant to science, and I think that's a challenge. And of course, one of the reasons philosophy of evolutionary theory has thrived so is because there are conceptual challenges there. And often when you read a paper, it could have been written by a theoretical biologist or by a philosopher of biology. You can't even tell the difference. Or I sometimes teach units in my philosophy of biology class where we read some papers by scientists and some by philosophers of biology on the same topic. So those conceptual issues in evolutionary theory have been very prominent in the field, and I think that it's been good. The field has done a lot of good work there. So I think connecting with history, connecting with the real science, doing things that tell us about actual science and, if possible, are useful to scientists, that's my kind of vision of what philosophy of science should be and is to some extent, and I hope will continue to be.
Well, I hope so. Yeah, I hope so too. So, if for folks who are hoping to do things relevant to the science, I mean, what is your general strategy? What do you do in terms of thinking about things? I mean, one way to start with projects is to generally ask yourself, okay, what am I interested in, or what are the problems, or perhaps what are the problems in the sciences that I'm interested in? But, what is your overall approach to philosophy of science?
Well, as I told you, I've been interested in discovery and reasoning and scientific change my whole career. And for a while, I tried to model that with computational systems, but I finally decided my best ideas come from reading the science in detail. So choosing a case study and immersing oneself in it and bringing your general philosophy questions, whatever they are, to that case study is, I think, the most fruitful way I've found to proceed as a method in the field.
Fantastic. Thank you. All right. Well, Lindley, we've come to about the end. It's a pleasure learning a bit about your origin story and some of your illustrious work that you've shared with us. Is there anything else you'd like to share, or at the very end, anything about your school or upcoming projects, or anything you'd like to give a shout out to?
No, I don't think so. I think the philosophy of biology is thriving, and I'm happy that the field is doing so well. And it's been very nice to be a part of that. And I wish the younger people coming along in the field all the best.
Okay. Well, Dr. Lindley Darden, thank you so much for joining us. It was a pleasure, and thank you for all of the stories. And Yeah, it was great to talk to you. And certainly at the next PSA and HSS meeting, I will come up and shake your hand and introduce myself. Well, thank you, Lindley. Have a good rest of the semester in Maryland, and I'll talk to you soon.
Okay. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.